This episode of Faith, Hope and Sport went on quite a bit beyond our normal 30 minutes or so I've cut it in two. You're listening to the first part now, and you'll find the second part in this month's Extra Time. Welcome back to Faith, Hope and Sport with Drew Gibson. Boxing, athletics, long-distance running. The New Testament seems to refer to each of these in a number of places. And by the way, it also seems to refer to that other sport, the life and death gladiatorial combats of the Roman Empire. I have New Testament expert Gordon Campbell with me today, and Gordon's going to help us sort the fact from the fiction. He'll use his detailed knowledge of the New Testament to show us where the genuine references to sport are, and where we've just got the wishful thinking of us sports addicts. Gordon, it's great to have you here with us today. You're very, very welcome. Gordon, we like to get to know folk who come here to the podcast, so would you tell us a bit about yourself? Where are you from? Where you grew up? A bit about your family?
Sure. Nice to have me here, Drew. Thank you. Always up for a chat. I'm a Belfast man, born in East Belfast, grew up in South Belfast, went to school and to university in Belfast. After getting married, taught for a little while, spent 16 years in France before returning then to Northern Ireland about 25 years ago, roughly. I've been a minister for most of that time. Sandra and I have 4 kids, none of whom is here. They're far-flung. We seem to have given them wings, but no roots.
Yes, it happens, doesn't it? France, tell us a little bit about what you're doing in France.
Sure. Back in the day, the Presbyterian Church in Ireland was considering partnerships with other churches, and particularly thinking about the European framework. The organisation that brings Reformed churches together in Europe meant that PCI already had some links. And one day, as a ministerial student, I discovered, hey-ho, that the French Reformed Church and the Presbyterian Church in Ireland were in discussion about some kind of a possible link-up. And there we have it. I got too interested and ended up inaugurating that. I spent 8 years in pastoral ministry, first in Cognac in the west of France and then down in Marseille in the south.
I take it you had a languages background that enabled you to
Yeah, so I studied
there.
French and German, and therefore was in a position to be able to go and be functional right from the start without language learning. And Sandra, my wife, had low-level French and a few years of Rust on top, so at least that gave her something to work with as well. Yes, I suppose I was also disposed at the time to think about overseas service, not quite knowing where that might be, but it turned out to be France. And after those years in pastoral work, I moved into theological teaching.
Okay, you mentioned Marseille there, so let me make a link.
Yeah.
If I'm right, the south of France would be the hotbed of French rugby. Is that fair?
Yes, especially the southwest.
Yes.
Now, it is played increasingly all over the country, but certainly if you're in Marseille, it will be the Olympic, the Olympique de Marseille that generates most interest. I was in the stadium just once, and on that particular occasion, Tony Cascarino, who spent a little while in Marseille, was on the score sheet. But a lot of people followed them pretty closely, and they're still doing okay in the European scene.
Yeah. Well, again, this is a wild guess, Gordon. It probably wasn't sport that took you to France in the first place. Sport wouldn't be a particularly big thing in your life, is that right?
I guess that's fair. I was never particularly sporty. My older brother seemed to get the sports gene. However, having said that, I'm a keen enough watcher of sport, as so many people are, but perhaps not keen enough to be a regular visitor to stadiums. I'd be much more likely to sit and watch something on TV and follow at a distance, therefore.
So if sport isn't a particularly big thing for you, why are you here?
Well, you are uniquely persuasive. Apart from which, I guess sport being such a huge cultural phenomenon, both for those who play it and for the many more who follow it or watch it, it relates to Christian living in so many contexts. And it's always helpful to bring a major cultural phenomenon into some sort of conversation with Scripture to see whether the two address one another in any kind of obvious conversation.
And it's that conversation, I think, that's important for you, because there's something that you've not mentioned that's core to why you're here. When you were teaching in France and then when you were teaching here in Union College in Belfast, what was your subject?
So my subject was New Testament.
And that seems to me to be a link, sport and the New Testament. Anybody who has thought about sport from a Christian perspective or listened to Christians talking about sport, sooner or later somebody's going to mention sport in the New Testament, and they'll pick up maybe things that St. Paul wrote and say, well, this obviously shows that sport was big in St. Paul's mind. Let's talk a bit more about it.
Yeah, and I think it's a case also of it being in the mind of both halves of the conversation. Because if I think of many fellow ministers who might be perhaps more keyed into sport than I would necessarily be, I notice how often sports jokes seem to come into the beginnings or the ends of conversations. Maybe not part of the serious stuff, but it's kind of there, and it's one of those connectors. And dare I say, in sermons,
yes,
it will often come to the fore as well, especially if a minister is maybe a sports chaplain or has played or still plays sport. Inevitably, one's own experience is brought to bear, and I think that would be a fairly frequent one, at least with meals.
Yes, no, I think you're right. But let's see if we can dig a little bit more deeply into the New Testament. I'm guessing here that in the Gospels, Acts and Revelation, at least, there's not much about sport. So can we set those to one side, or is there anything we need to look at there?
I think that's fair enough, perhaps with one small exception for Acts. In a particular part of Acts that many interpreters, when they're talking about it, forget is not by Paul, but by Luke. There's an occasion, it's Paul's farewell to the Ephesian elders, where Luke gives some kind of representation or summary of what Paul said. And often that's assumed to be Paul speaking. It's in fact Luke placing words in Paul's mouth, which may well have a proper historical reference, but it's Luke, not Paul. And there, interestingly, there is a little reference by Paul to finishing his course. And so because it's not by Paul, but because it is a reminiscence of Paul's speaking, it suggests that there might be something fairly basic about the things Paul says that has to do with a course or a run or sporting vocabulary in general. So Acts has that one little confirmation that it may be an important element of things that Paul says in his letters.
Right. Well, let's take a look at some of Paul's letters then. Well, where do we start? Why don't we start with one that seems to me to be a direct sporting reference, but with a little bit of an edge to it. And I'm thinking here 1 Corinthians 9, particularly around about verse 24 to 27, where we have run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. And then he changed a little bit in the next verse. Therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. And then the change, I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave. Is that fairly clearly a sporting reference there?
Okay, how does one go about answering that question? I suppose at some basic level we think, well, is there sports vocabulary? Mm-hmm. And actually that is a very important criterion. And I suppose I would say there has to be enough sports vocabulary for words that may carry a sporting sense actually to be proved to have that. Because most words are variable.
Yes.
It's the same today in the words that we use, and depending on the context, a given word might have a particular colour to it. And that's the case with the vocabulary there in 1 Corinthians 9 and elsewhere. And actually, in a total of 8 of Paul's letters, there are 13 attributed to him, and a total of 8 of them, including 5 of the ones that everybody agrees he wrote, and 3 of the ones that sometimes give rise to discussion as to whether it's Paul or an associate of Paul who's writing. 8 out of the 13 have got vocabulary which might have a sporting edge to it. Mm-hmm. And the way to assess that is to ask, is there enough of an analogy going on? Is there other supporting vocabulary? Mm-hmm. And from what you just said by reading it out, we can see that there are a number of words. There are the verbal ones that suggest things like running or boxing. To box is that verb acting like a boxer, or even the one about battering or pummeling his own body, because the verb actually means to give somebody a black eye, so precisely what a boxer does.
Yes.
So I think there is enough vocabulary there in 1 Corinthians 9 for us to have to conclude that it's highly likely that it is a kind of sustained analogy for the kinds of sport that might have been well known in the Corinth of the day, with the Isthmian Games going on every couple of years. So boxing as one form, and some kind of short race as another form of that. And the real question then afterwards is, okay, so if Paul does seem to be using the vocabulary and alluding to the kind of activities that suggest ancient sport, why might he do that? In other words, what's he on about?
Yeah.
Why resort to an analogy? This isn't a pause in his conversation where he's decided to crack a sports joke or ask somebody, did their team do well on Saturday, the kinds of things that we do. But rather he's using this as some kind of meaningful element to what he's otherwise saying in 1 Corinthians 9, indeed in the whole of the letter. And that's where we would then want to interrogate, well, why resort to sport at all?
Yeah, you've probably led us down what seems to me to be the right path. Looking at it from the point of view of a preacher or a teacher, he's making some contact. You mentioned the Isthmian Games, big games, well known in Corinth for many years, familiar to everybody, and therefore it would seem to be a natural connection for him to make. Again, sound fair?
Yes, and I think it's probably on the level of talking to the Corinthians in ways that they would understand, things that would resonate with them. But then it becomes all the more clear to say, yes, but he's not really talking about sport, is he? He's not supplying enough depth or breadth even to what he's saying. Okay, there are runners, okay, there's a stadium, there's some sense of a wreath or a garland at the end of it for the one person who happens to win. By the way, there was nothing for anybody else. And so all of that suggests that they'd be nodding at the thought, here's the sort of thing that we're famous for.
So he's using it for a particular purpose.
Yeah.
And for us as interpreters.
And it's quite challenging, I think, to figure out just why. And to answer that particular one, how do verses 24 to 27 fit into 1 Corinthians 9? I think we have to ask, what is this chapter about? And that's a good question for 1 Corinthians, almost chapter by chapter, because Paul deals with a whole series of issues, many of them having been put to him by the Corinthians themselves. So the question is, what's the issue in 1 Corinthians 9?
Yep.
And the issue seems to be, above all, a defence of his own ministry.
Yes.
Which assumes then that among his hearers are those who don't take him or his ministry necessarily at face value. He's having to defend himself here.
Yes, that sounds right to me, because of the verse that follows after that I didn't read, verse 27. No, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. So there seems to be some sort of tension going on in there.
Well, if I were to be a smidgen provocative...
Oh, why not?
Or at least to ask an awkward question that might lead us somewhere. Supposing here that Paul is defending himself the way a boxer would.
Okay.
Is he under attack?
So he's defending himself by keeping his hands up?
He might actually be drawing the Corinthians in on a common sporting topic and then saying, but hold on a minute, I'm the one being hit here. Because 1 Corinthians 9 talks about him winning a lot. But that winning is winning people to Christ. And some verses or sentences or moments in the reading of the letter aloud earlier, he says that in order to win or to gain people for the gospel, he makes himself everyone's slave. And that's to win the greatest number possible, verse 19. Or he makes himself all things to everyone so as to win at least some, verse 22. So we're almost at these verses. So given renewed use of the first person singular in verse 26, where he says, I run in a certain way, I fight or I box in a certain way, it seems logical to me that the sporting analogy is Paul unpacking what it means for him to win as an apostle. In other words, his ministry. And it's his ministry that's been under scrutiny in Corinth and has been found by some to be not up to the standard that they're looking for. And there, it wouldn't be so much the sporting performance that they don't think Paul has, but rather the kind of orator performance, the sort of public speaker, his words and his person and his deeds all add up to somebody a bit special, someone that we can regard highly. Paul doesn't seem to fit that kind of a frame.
No, we're told that fairly specifically, aren't we?
And he's happy to admit himself that he comes to them in weakness and so on.
Yes.
So, yeah, the question of why he alludes to this, I think, is a very interesting question in itself.
Could we look at something else at the start of that section, verse 24, that I think I might find problematic, and particularly problematic in Corinth, where he says, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize." Well, think of Corinth. There was a lot of trouble in Corinth, a lot of infighting. He seems to be saying there, well, make sure that you're fighting better than everyone else so that you get the prize and these others who are causing trouble don't get the prize.
Yeah, well, I venture to suggest that what I said just now might still be the key there, because I wonder if he is still wishing to talk about the individual that he is, the apostle that he is, and to invite each of the Corinthians to judge themselves in the same way. So he's been open himself about what the prize constitutes for him, and that is the prize of Christ's well done for having fulfilled the apostolic ministry he was given. And I suspect that he's inviting the Corinthians to look on their own individual discipleship of Christ in the same way. Their prize is the well done for their faithfulness and their obedience in relation to the ministry that they have. But then that, of course, would oblige them to look at themselves, to self-examine in the same way that Paul is doing here outwardly for others to listen. He's kind of talking to himself, and at the same time he's having them listen in. And I think it's in that sense certainly that I would understand his exhortation to run well enough to win it. He's actually challenging them in a non-threatening but nonetheless pointed way, if they've been following him at all, to look at themselves as well as to look at him, and to see whether they can understand their own lives in relation to the prize that awaits. And the prize is only for the one person who wins, and they would know that. So there's only one prize. So if he's talking about the prize, either he's saying, and I'm the only one who's going to win this, guys, which I suppose he could be if he were boasting in the absolute sense. But since he only ever boasts and says he only ever boasts in Christ, and since the prize for him is that well done from Christ whom he has faithfully preached, he is probably encouraging them to have another look at their lives and at the trajectory of those lives and at the aim or the purpose of those lives, and to think about what wreath or garland awaits them. So in that sense, he would be borrowing from the sporting phenomenon and the prize for the one who does best. He would be borrowing from that and saying, here's a way that we can understand the course or the race of our own lives. And actually, in that sense, the race, the word itself does carry within it the capacity to mean something like a career or a life in that sense. So I think probably all of that might be going on.
Yes, so it's not an encouragement to compete with other Christians. It's more of an internal, spiritual competition to win the prize.
I think so, and I think he's careful enough in the way this chapter is organised for them to see that he's drawing them into his self-reflection on an individual basis and commending to them the same self-reflection. And that's very interesting because, of course, it's a culture that is very collective.
Yes.
And in Corinth, the collectiveness of it has also brought conflict for all the reasons that the letter develops. But even so, Paul always assumes that there's personal buy-in, that there's individual buy-in, even if the church as an entity or the people of God as an entity is probably more important than we give credit for in our highly individualistic modern world. I think he's inviting each Corinthian, really, to examine him or herself, their view of the apostles and of the gospel, and to answer the question for themselves of how faithful and how obedient they themselves are in preaching Christ, in living for Christ, in manifesting Christ in their lives within the city of Corinth, in whatever way of life they're involved in.
You're listening to Faith, Hope and Sport. Let's take a quick break.
Azariah and Abigail have a big problem.
What's wrong? Abigail?
Oh, Azariah, it was awful.
What?
The women. Some of them were at the well when I went earlier. Oh, Azariah, why do they despise me so? The names they called me, I've never done any of them any harm.
I've a good mind to go out and give a few of them a piece of my mind.
Oh, Azariah, I love you so, but that wouldn't do any good. They'd only turn on you too.
Anyway, the outcome of our talk later was that she was going to go to the well at a time when no one else did, in the middle of the day. It was very hot then, but at least she'd be left in peace.
But there's a stranger at the well, and their lives are changed forever. Commission presents The Samaritan. You can hear this series and many others. Just search for Commission Radio Drama wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, Will Leach here to remind you about my podcast, The Commission Files. Great faith stories and interviews with the Christian people making a difference in society. And we like a bit of music too. All produced by Commission Christian Radio. Find us wherever you look for podcasts. Just search for The Commission Files.
Welcome back to Faith, Hope and Sport with Drew Gibson. I'm talking to New Testament expert Gordon Campbell about sport in the New Testament. Okay, so we've looked at 1 Corinthians. Where do you think we should go now in looking at some of the other things that Paul has written? Or if I could maybe ask a specific question, do you think he always uses sporting metaphors for that same purpose, or does he use them for different purposes?
I think he uses them for a range of purposes. If I were to try and find one purpose that covers as many of them as possible, it would probably be the purpose of illustrating that in some basic way, Christian living is a struggle.
Yes.
You might say a fight, a contest, a competition, not in the sense of competing against others, but being tested.
The struggle that you talk about is an internal struggle, not a struggle with other Christians.
It seems to be a basic understanding of Paul that to follow Jesus entails facing hardship, overcoming obstacles, wrestling, struggling with oneself, one's sinful self, but also with what can attend the gospel by way of lack of response or opposition in
persecution
response.
Even.
Persecution can be the sharper end of that. And it's interesting to compare a couple of other letters, depending on how you reconstruct the life of Paul and where you place the production of the letters in that. One of the candidates for being the first letter that might have been written is 1 Thessalonians. It's not the only candidate, but it is commonly understood by many to be the first. And in chapter 2 and verse 2 we read, "With the help of our God we dared to tell you his gospel in the face of strong opposition or great struggle." And that depends on how you translate the key word in all of this, which is agon, which is sometimes a contest.
From which we get the word agony.
Indeed, yes. But therein, of course, is the problem in that the English equivalent of a Greek word can sometimes be a red herring, and it is for some of the other words in this context. But there at least is the sense that Paul understands that when he came to Thessalonica to share the gospel, and the Thessalonians themselves understand this, he had to face up to big trouble in order to do that. And then a little later in that chapter, he says, "What is our hope, our joy, or the crown in which we glory in the presence of our Lord Jesus? Is it not you?" Now that's very interesting because we get crown, which of course, as we saw in 1 Corinthians, is one of those sports-associated words in that it may well refer to the wreath or the garland. I think originally in Corinth it was a celery wreath, and then in Roman times that was replaced with pine.
There you go.
But regardless, it's interesting that if this is the first use of crown by Paul to the Thessalonians, it comes along with hope and joy. And if we look at Philippians, there is a case in Philippians 4 where he says, "You whom I long for, my joy and crown, stand firm in the Lord in this way." So that association of joy and crown, or in the case of 1 Thessalonians, hope, joy and crown, already tells us that when he resorts to using the notion of a wreath or a garland or a crown, which the Corinthians in particular would easily associate with what the athlete will get if he is successful. I said he because there was some female athleticism in the ancient world, but it wasn't as practiced, certainly in the Greek context, as by males. By that first usage, Paul is actually associating it straight away with something bedrock Christian, hope or joy, and actually saying, the crown that I will receive from Christ is the crown that you are, because you are my converts, effectively. He's saying, I've brought you the gospel, and so you have responded, and in that sense, you are my crown. I've already got my reward in the fact that you have come to Jesus through my preaching. I had to preach. It's something I have to do, and this is the result of it. So I think it's very interesting to see the way in which he is resorting there right from the start to something with a sporting connotation, but he's actually filling it with his own content, which is Christian content. He actually uses crown there to refer to those who have been won for Christ through his apostolic ministry.
And it's a very warm thing to do, isn't it? It's a very relationship-building thing to do.
It is, especially when associated with joy, and there with the Philippians saying to them, look, I love you, I long for you. Commentators have often picked up the warmth of Paul's relationship with the Philippians doesn't seem to be equalled in the other letters. This seems to be particularly relationally warm, despite the fact that he's in prison and unable to be with them. That warmth, that relational closeness seems to crunch the miles that separate his prison from their everyday life.
Mm-hmm. Could we take a wee look at a couple of places in 2 Timothy? For example, chapter 2, verse 5, he moves from a military picture in verse 4 to say, similarly, anyone who competes as an athlete does not receive the victor's crown except by competing according to the rules. And then in chapter 4, verse 8, he talks about being in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. Do you think that's using crown in the same way as he has used it before, or is he using crown in a different way to Timothy?
Easy questions, harder answers. I suppose my hesitation is that partly I want to say, let's also look at 1 Timothy.
Okay, yes.
And that's for the second of the ones that you referred to, but you actually picked up in chapter 4 the second bit about the crown of righteousness, whereas previously in the preceding sentence Paul has also said, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race. And what's significant about that is that fought is the verb agonizomai, and the fight itself is agon, which can be contest or race or struggle, as we've already seen. So two things about that. In 1 Timothy, Paul actually tells his recipient, Timothy, to fight the good fight, or to struggle the good struggle, if we want to change the translation for a moment.
Yep.
Because in that particular context, he says, pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, and gentleness. Now, there's nothing athletic about any of those, except perhaps the verb pursue. And then the next sentence is fight or struggle the good fight of the faith. Now, in that context, I would say, given our previous chat, there just isn't enough vocabulary there by way of sporting analogy for us to think that it is one. But clearly, some sort of struggle or fight, which wouldn't be unlike what a wrestler or a boxer might be doing in a sporting context, is at the heart of what Paul wants to say. But what's the fight involving? Well, it's showing the fruit of the Spirit. It's striving for things like godliness and endurance and so forth. So what's interesting is that in 1 Timothy, Paul tells Timothy to do this, fight the good fight of the faith. And then when 2 Timothy comes along, we find Paul claiming, I have fought the good fight, or I have struggled the good struggle. I have finished the race. Now there the word race could be career or life. So you can say the struggles of life, and now my life is done struggling, as it were. Or you could, of course, because the vocabulary might allow it, you could think in terms of athletics. And why might you? Well, as you said earlier in chapter 2, we actually have this analogy between the analogy of a soldier, and there was a following one about a farmer. And in between is the one about an, yes, athlete. Anyone who competes as an athlete, and the verb is atleo, so our word, yes. Athletic. And here it means precisely that. It's what you do if you strive or contend or win in the public games. So that was the technical term. Doesn't mean it's its only use, but that's what it was used to mean. And it says, anyone who competes as an athlete, as you said, does not receive the victor's crown except by competing. That's atleo again, according to the rules. So the question would be, is that still in mind in chapter 4 when Paul is saying, I've finished my career? Does he mean I've finished my race? Is he referring to the getting to the end of a race? And I suppose the only sort of doubt that I would want to register at that point is that we are mistaken in thinking that races went on and on and on. Read modern marathon. Probably there was no race longer than about 3 miles in the ancient context. So we need to bear that in mind and not think in terms of, so he saw his life as one long marathon or endurance. I don't know how many sermons will have said that. Sorry, but that is probably not in the mind of either the writer or the reader. But nonetheless, the idea of a life filled with struggle clearly is. And so I would say that in 2 Timothy, yes, in chapter 2, the idea of competing according to the rules seems like recourse to athletics and running right, doing what was expected and behaving as the athlete should according to whatever rules were in place. But by the time you get to chapter 4 and he's saying, I've fought the good fight, I've struggled the good struggle, he's really saying, look, Timothy, my life's almost at an end and I've wrestled and struggled as well, And I told you in the first letter, if you like to fight the good fight, well, now I've done that and it's over to you to do the same. So again, athletics is in there, but maybe not decisive in that second case. And so that leads me to say, well, maybe the crown of righteousness has got shifted in terms of its content. It's still not primarily athletic, but he seems to be picking up on the righteousness which only the righteous judge himself, God, can actually declare. So if I am to be found righteous, as I am in name through Christ's acceptance of me, then it will be awarded me on that day. And what does he mean? Well, have I been faithful in keeping the faith, in sharing the faith, in bringing up new leaders in the church like you, Timothy, who've been my lieutenant, my right-hand man? I think that's the kind of framework in which he's using crown. So there's maybe a little bit of a shift there. But then we were saying earlier, the crown is those in whom Paul's joy and hope are placed. You've come to Christ, and my hope is that you'll still be Christ's at that great day. And so this is just a little variation maybe on that, where it's a little bit more personal, where he is among those whom Christ has awarded with the crown.
Thank you for listening to Faith, Hope and Sport. You'll find the second part in this month's Extra Time. Why not subscribe if you haven't done so already? We record in the studios of Commission Radio. If you'd like to know more about Commission, or if you think you'd like to be involved by supporting us prayerfully or financially, or even if you might have something to offer to actually making programmes, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram or LinkedIn. Or of course you could just ask nice Mr. Google, or go to the Edge, or go on Safari, or wherever, to find commissionradio.org. I look forward to being with you again soon, when I'll be chatting with Colin Morrison about a rather obvious question. What exactly is sport? And we'll find out that the answer to that question isn't quite as straightforward as you might think.